England, the nation of royals, gentlemen, football hooligans, and complex history. Today, I want to focus on one of the most significant events in British history, the Industrial Revolution. If I were to ask you to picture life in Britain before the Industrial Revolution, images of kings, noblemen, and peasants would come to mind. However, if I asked you to picture life in England shortly after the Industrial Revolution, you would most likely imagine Victorian gentlemen and polluted brick wall cities. These images aren't entirely incorrect and illustrate the profound changes that occurred during the Industrial Revolution. I would like to focus specifically on how the Industrial Revolution impacted the British nobility. During the roughly 80 years of industrialization, the aristocracy saw the previously undisputed rule slowly chipped away by the workers demanding ever more rights. You might, however, be surprised where the nobility ended up in the end. Let's start shortly before the Industrial Revolution kicked off. England was a constitutional monarchy and currently in its Georgian era. The aristocracy consisted of the monarchy, the peerage, and the gentry. The monarchy was, of course, the king and his family, to whom everybody else answered. The peerage was the traditional aristocracy. They had hereditary titles, owned vast amounts of land, formed an exclusive society that married only within their own class. They became lawmakers and clergymen, and held officer ranks in the military. They were also the only ones eligible to become members of the House of Lords. The gentry were similar, except their titles were not considered noble and they weren't always hereditary. They could also not become members of the House of Lords and were restricted to the House of Commons. While they were a bit lower on the societal ladder than the peerage, they were still immensely wealthy and powerful for the time. Imagine Mr. Darcy from Pride and Prejudice. Now, while England was technically a democracy, only members of these classes were allowed to vote. They also owned most of the land in the country, and since England was still largely agricultural, they controlled a significant portion of the nation's economic output. These facts placed them firmly in control of Britain, and at the time, land meant wealth, but the Industrial Revolution was about to change that a bit. With the advent of steam power and industry, profit shifted away from agricultural regions to the cities with their factories and workers. Nobility in rural regions saw the value of their land suddenly plummet, while those who owned lands in established cities like London saw the value of their estates skyrocket. Industrial towns such as Manchester sprang up all over the country, giving rise to a new group of people, the industrialists, the entrepreneurs, and skilled middle-class workers who grew rich from the economic boom industrialization brought. This new reality meant that the aristocrats could no longer rely solely on their large swaths of land. They also had to develop them according to new trends. And to do that, they needed a new kind of wealth, capital. Fortunately for them, the aristocracy owned substantial assets that they could liquidate to raise cash. They invested that cash then in property in rapidly growing cities, became shareholders in new companies, and started to industrialize farming on their rural lands. Those who did not manage to adapt to these new circumstances saw themselves unable to keep up with the running costs of their estates and lifestyle. And as a solution, these noblemen would then marry the wealthy heiresses of commoners who coveted the prestige of their titles, while they themselves would receive a substantial dowry. Now, those who quickly adapted became richer than ever, and things were looking good for the nobility. However, the workers and this new class of wealthy commoners started to demand a say in how the country was run. A series of reforms starting in 1832 slowly increased the percentage of men who were allowed to vote to 60% by 1884. And then finally, 40 years later in 1928, every adult over 21 years old, including women, was made eligible to vote. And with each of these reforms, the power of the aristocracy was diluted more and more. However, they retained one last privilege until 1999, which is when the requirement to be part of the nobility to sit in the House of Lords was abolished. While an increasing number of commoners were allowed a say in governing matters, the nobility still remained politically influential for a long time due to their retained connections and wealth. Unlike in France or Russia, the British nobility was never systematically purged, and to this day, there remain at least 806 members of the peerage listed on Wikipedia. So that means that the British aristocracy never really disappeared. They might have lost their privileges, and then later on in World War I, a lot of people, but they are still very much able to rely on their generational wealth and societal status.